everybody's experienced, some form of danger in their life, whether it's psychological or real physical imminent harm. We all know what that feels like. Your heart races. You just want to escape. Well, your cells experience that too. It's called the cell danger response, and it is the nervous system's powerful role in addressing threats, but also when it's on overdrive, it can contribute to chronic diseases. And today, Dr. Mel Hopper Koppelman is going to teach us all about it. I'm excited because it's not something I know much about, but this is an ancient cellular defense mechanism that can get stuck on overdrive, especially with all of the type A personalities out there, or the uber connected 24/7 attachment to technology, or anything else that might be going on in your life. That chronic cell danger response contributes to you getting sick and staying sick. So let's dive in and learn how the nervous system affects all of this and what you can do about it. Thank you for being here, Dr. Koppelman.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat about it.
So teach me a little bit about what this is, this concept, because I'm not that familiar with it.
Cool. I think it's really when people come across a lot of pennies drop. So the cell danger response, it's a model that was developed by an MD PhD researcher named Bob Navio. And over many years, he's a geneticist and amongst other things, very smart guy. And it's basically a, a first principles understanding of how we've evolved from single cells, right? So our body's made of 70 trillion cells. Half of them, or at least half of them, are microbial. Others are ours. And yet they kind of work as a cohesive whole where you have this identity of like you and me and, trying to get from A to B, and etc. And what he discovered through experimentation and different genetics research and a lot of metabolomics research, which I'm happy to describe, is that when a cell is threatened or stressed, and it doesn't really matter what the threat or stressor is, it goes through a three-step process in order to heal. And we tend to refer to parts of those steps as inflammation, but it really wants to be broken down further. And so if we're chronically ill, it just means that the healing cycle that your cells are trying to go through gets stuck. And then it kind of follows from that the way to heal then is to unstick that process, which obviously you could write books about. But that's the idea, is that it can't go backwards, it needs to go forwards. And so that concept of a three-step process that cells go through to heal is actually what explains almost all of our biochemistry. We're used to looking at these individual markers. So that's a little bit about that, and the nervous system orchestrates how those trillions of
What's
cells
kind of the
together.
big picture of those three steps?
Yep. Great question. So first step is what we tend to think of as innate immunity and acute inflammation. So histamine responses, redness, swelling, it's really about containment. The first cellular stressor was a virus. So it's really about changing, and all of this is orchestrated by a part of the cell called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is getting an increasing amount of well-deserved attention. So we need to understand that the mitochondria, they make energy, but they also are orchestrating our danger responses. And they can shift modes. They are orchestrating whether or not we are building ourselves up or breaking ourselves down. And so what we think of as acute inflammation is an orchestration of that response to contain a viral threat, to use oxidative stress actually to shield healthy cells, and to use the energy that was used for normal cellular physiology and living life and having energy. We use that same energy in order to combat threat. Once we successfully contain that and we kind of hopefully stop the damage and kill the virus and do those things, then step two is about rebuilding tissue, rebuilding damaged tissue. So there has been damage, there's been destruction, and now we're in what's called the cell cycle, which is really where cells divide and and grow tissue. Okay, if we get stuck in that, we call that cancer. And if once that's complete, again, once our liver is the right size again, or our thumb, is whole again, then we move into step three, which is about teaching new cells how to be in your three-dimensional matrix, right? So your new cell needs to learn from the grandparent cells how to be a liver cell in your liver. And so that's partly about connecting up in this three-dimensional matrix. That's partly about oscillations of waves because all of our cells are moving at a steady beat that's the same as the tissues that they're a part of. And then once all of that's complete, then you have healthy cells again. If they're stronger than before, we call that something that there's a term called hormesis, which means, like, for example, when you exercise, the idea is that you become stronger. So those are the three steps. And anywhere, if enough cells get stuck, then we call that illness.
It sounds like a lot of what's driving this is the microenvironment, that the molecules and fluid that is those cells are bathed in, and that are helping cells communicate to each other and activating genes and proteins and biochemical pathways that are reacting essentially to just what's immediately in their surroundings, just like we do as whole integrated organisms walking around in the world. We react to our surroundings, and what I'm understanding is our cells are doing that too.
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely that, and it's both. So what you're describing is what we would call a bottom up pathway. So if the cells are in an unhealthy environment, what happens all the time, and most of research doesn't really understand this big picture, so they're describing kind of parts of the elephant. So they understand that if a cell comes out of the cell cycle and the environment is still inflammatory, it's going to get upset and go back in. But they don't realize it's the environment. But at the same time, getting stuck in traffic can also start to recruit resources, or these psychological stressors can be more of a top-down mechanism where your body starts to change its resources and have threats as well.
But that still changes the microenvironment around the
Yes.
cell, because you're secreting cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that's affecting cellular function and blood flow as well.
Yep. So it is. It's I would say it's both at the same time. So anything as above, so below. So if there's enough
Yep.
stressors going on at the bottom, that'll make us feel psychologically stressed. And conversely, if we have stressful thoughts, or we're in stressful situations, or we don't feel we have enough resources to handle what's being asked of us, that will also change the cellular microenvironment.
You mentioned metabolomics at the beginning, so I'd love for you to define that and help people understand how that relates.
Sure. So many people are used to having, let's say, a routine blood test done at their docs, maybe get a couple dozen markers. A lot of those have been used for a very long time, which actually in some ways is good, the tried and true, where we have really good data on them. But in a way, we're kind of looking at little markers individually. Metabolomics is a way that we can look at overall shifts in the metabolism, kind of looking at almost everything at once. And so we can look at global shifts. And so it kind of the way it gets imagined is it's like almost like looking at lights on a Christmas tree. It's kind of interesting. But for example, we're so used to thinking about chemicals and pathways and how you might change individual things with either a drug or a nutrient. But if you were to change, let's say, the temperature of something, everything would change at once. And so metabolomics is the way that we study that. And it's been out, for, I would say, at least over a decade. And it's really, in many ways, has replaced the understandings that we had when we had these just individual markers, but we're still, most of medicine is still interpreting health according to these individual markers.
So is that metabolomics is my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that how substances are metabolized, and the waste products and the metabolites that are produced from those processes.
Yeah, so the omics part is just the measurement of that.
Correct. So for example, if you drink caffeine, you're gonna get metabolites of caffeine that appear in the urine. Or if you are functionally low in vitamin B12, you may end up getting a methylmalonate, a urinary organic acid, spilling out in the urine, showing you need more B12. So that's a urinary organic acids test that I think of, when I think of functional medicine. Would that be considered also part of metabolomics or not?
I think most people would. I think that maybe the distinction I'm making is
Yeah.
that when you look in research, you can see more global shifts. Like actually, caffeine is a really good example, because caffeine is interfering with something called ATP, which is our energy processing, and ATP gets converted into something called adenosine. And this is actually one of those pathways that is 3 billion years old from single-celled organisms. And it's kind of the alpha and omega of our biochemistry. So when you take caffeine, You absolutely can measure caffeine metabolites, but when I'm talking about metabolomics, I'm saying that you changed everything. That there's probably not a marker in your machinery that if you measured it would be the same after giving something that blocks adenosine, as an example. Or if you were to give a methyl donor, like you were mentioning, you can measure the breakdown of that, but it's what happens to everything else when you do that.
So to help me understand then, like clinically, or I'm a patient and I'm coming to you and I've got whatever, pick a chronic disease that that you see quite a bit. Help me understand then how this approach informs, how the questions you may ask, your assessment and testing, and walk me through then that, because I'd love to understand more.
Yeah, sure. So I have a bit of a mixed clinical background in terms
Yeah.
of, so I studied Chinese medicine. I then went on to get a master's in functional medicine and nutrition before kind of hitting a little bit of a roadblock clinically and also in my personal health. And was able to kind of get around that roadblock or overcome it through studying the nervous system, neurology, developmental neurology, and applied neurology, but also going back to my Chinese medicine roots and really understanding it better using herbs. And so one of the big breakthroughs I had after years of looking at pathways and organic acids tests and individual markers was that when I came across the cell danger response, there was actually an original paper. Bob Navia has published quite a few papers. They're seminal papers. Anybody who's interested in biochemistry who looks at labs really, it's worth taking the time to read them. But his first paper in 2014, he described how normally when cells are healthy, they are cycling between summer and winter metabolism. And so again, if you do nothing, if the person is just healthy and fine and you repeatedly measure their bloods, they will change according to the season. And when a cell is stressed or infected and we get inflammation, that's like a big version of summer, right? That's like big, it's the difference between warmth and fire, right? And what I realized was that this was actually what the classical Chinese medicine was describing as hot and cold, which is like a fundamental principle of how we look at people. So the way that I use this in practice is I actually teach people how to identify this themselves. And we can see that when we look at metabolomics research of Chinese herbs, for example, or formulas, that they're basically influencing these pathways, everything at once. And it's what I would consider to be a higher leverage starting point when working with people or working with your own system, especially if you're talking about something that's chronic, where it's not an emergency. We don't have like a lost heartbeat or something where we have to kind of use something really big to kind of save someone's life. When we're talking about something chronic, then really adjusting what I call it kind of first principles, so temperature, hot and cold, moisture, dry versus damp. We can get a lot farther. We can, each person can learn how to observe their progress with their own eyes, and that we see that it's working on this level.
I think it's fascinating that you're combining your Chinese medicine training with very much a conventional Western research and applications, and you've made some fascinating connections that I think only you uniquely could identify, given how you've combined these different educational paths that you've had. What I'm not hearing is conventionally we do a lot of testing.
Hmm.
And what I'm hearing is this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but teaching patients, this is my interpretation, more to be in tune with their bodies and understand what they need while using, as you mentioned, herbs to help rebalance the system, cool it down if it's too hot, heat it up if it's too cold, things of that nature. Am I getting this correctly?
Yeah, that's right. So I work with people mainly remotely, and I am guiding them through this process. So back, after I did my master's degree in functional medicine, I did quite a lot of additional study using labs and lab-based supplementation and biochemistry. And quite a few things happened. I thought I was kind of, I was going down PubMed rabbit holes, and I thought I was going to sort of decode the whole thing and get to the end and find the gold. And I was, tracking, different types of amino acids that grab sunlight and try to find these pathways, getting kind of a little weird with it. And what I what I ultimately realize is that, taking a step back, we don't usually need to start with those pathways. But the other thing that I realized sequentially over time, over years, is that there's a lot of really problematic assumptions that go into lab tests, what they're measuring and how they're interpreted, most of which are fatal flaws. So when I find these problems, they're not like nitpicky details. They kind of like each problem is like, how can we use this to guide decision making? These are profound problems. So I find that I still use lab tests just a lot less, and it's really about keeping it at arm's length. The people that I see tend to have been around the block quite a few times, and many of them have lots of labs already, so they don't really need to do more labs when they get to me unless there's a compelling reason to do so. But I, can help them by putting it into context. And sometimes we can use it just to monitor. But it's very rare that I'll kind of address something that's in that biochemical level directly. We would only do that if we needed to. We don't usually.
Oh my God, this is so fascinating to me because it parallels a lot of my sort of journey and evolution clinically as well in the research and all my research into osteoporosis and the articles and books that I've written. And when I've done into the, dived into the research, which I have now for almost 20 years, and I learned more about the testing, the vast majority of the testing is based on false assumptions,
Yep.
really very tenuous and weak connections to the most important thing we're looking at, which is reducing somebody's fracture risk. And the older I've gotten, the more I've done this, the less testing I do. And the more it sounds like it's very much in line with your philosophy and approach. And what you learn is that we're trying to rebalance the systems. And osteoporosis is essentially a disease of imbalance where the destructive forces are winning. And I'm using different language to talk about it, but it really hits home with me what you're saying.
Yeah, awesome. I think, it takes enough time it's swimming in these waters, and then you start to, at least for me, when I first started, it was very exciting. I liked looking at the data. I liked the sense of certainty that it gave me, where instead of just, I don't know, doing something like woo-woo and airy-fairy, we could look at this data, and I got some, I had some good results with patients initially at the time, and but the more I dove into it, the more I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is not saying what people are saying that it's saying. And when I treat this way, the results are very unreliable. And so it turns out that, whenever you're looking at a lab or a research paper, you have to really understand the question you're asking. And then you need to think about the best way to answer that question. And for me, with my patients, is rarely at the microscopic level. And if it is, that's fine. We can absorb that. But it's almost a course correction from, culturally, whether it's industrial medicine or functional medicine. I would say perhaps an overfocus on the microscopic.
It's so fascinating because you said, not biochemically, um or microscopically. I forget which word. I think it's microscopically.
Yeah.
And yet we started out this conversation talking about cells,
Yeah.
which are microscopic.
Hmm.
And so it's really coming full circle, and it's as if you need to understand at that fundamental level of how things are functioning in order to pull back and recognize that ultimately it's a systems issue that is both, as you said, top down and bottom up. And so when you're working with patients, then tell me then what your approach is besides the herbs, because
Yep.
you mentioned the herbs. And with these chronic diseases that people have, we all know that conventional medicine does a terrible job of treating it. I mean, it's just mostly masking symptoms. So what is the difference? How would you walk through somebody to understand what they would do working with you for, and please pick a specific, I say Western diagnosis because in Chinese medicine, your diagnosis is going to have a different name and different underlying issues. But, talk in language that anybody from
Yeah.
here, the West, as we are all raised, can understand.
Sure. And a few distinctions. One is I love talking about herbs, I think because I had such an intense relationship with individual nutrients, but actually the approach is somewhat agnostic to the tools that you're using. It's really about how to organize them. And the other is in terms of diagnosis, because that's a good point. Like if you go to see an acupuncturist, it's like a whole different language, a whole different culture. But really, because of coming at health from these different backgrounds, what I feel like I'm looking at and can really want to help people see themselves is looking at the first principles of health, which are kind of not particular to any culture, right? So we do have labels, but once we start to actually be able to see things with our eyes and be able to observe, then it's not about Chinese medicine or Western medicine or anything like that. So I tend to work with a lot of people who have what they might be labeled as having chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or mold illness or chronic Lyme or autoimmune conditions. We're not treating diseases, of course, we're supporting people. But a big distinction that I came across from excellent teachers of mine is figuring out what order to help someone in. Because this was the other problem that I would, I was treating the way I was trained. I would, someone would come in with complex presentation. It wasn't a question of whether or not they had inflammation or an infection or digestive issues or if they had any mental health challenges. Almost all of them had all of these, because they go together. So it was, and it wasn't a question about whether or not we would find anything on the labs. Of course we would, right? Because it's fractal. You're not going to have someone who feels terrible who has healthy biochemistry. They don't go together. So it was really a question of like, what do I do with this person in front of me, and where do I start? Because starting with everything at once, it's overwhelming and it's not fruitful. And so in various trainings, different people that I trained with would have different answers to that question of where to start. There wasn't, in my opinion, much of a rationale for it. A lot of the biochemical based therapies have a very short history or short lineage, they haven't been around that long. And so there's a lot of good ideas and a lot of innovations, but not this continued sort of wisdom of where we kind of have some mileage and we know, some reps where we know. And so what I learned was that in terms of the order to go in, it wasn't about the right thing to do to get the person better fastest. It was, where do you start where you're least likely to make this person worse and crash their system? Because a lot of the people I work with have multiple systems that are compromised that are sort of leaning on each other. And so if you start in different places, then you can create different problems. And so, for example, some therapies and some approaches like to increase circulation as a way of helping someone have more energy. But if they have a chronic infection or some sort of pathogen, then the body is actually trying to reduce circulation as a protective mechanism. And when we increase the circulation, we actually give the pathogen a kind of more of a pass into the body, so we can create problems. And this is why, for example, it's not uncommon for someone with fibromyalgia or mold illness or Lyme to go for a massage and then have like a total crash the next day. So we don't start with increasing blood circulation for that reason. There are other things, a lot of schools will say to start with the digestion. That was how I was initially trained. And again, sometimes we could get good results with that, but I ended up seeing more and more patients who had already started with that, before coming to see me. They're like, I've cleaned up my diet, I've treated all the parasites, I've done all of these things, I'm gluten-free, and I'm still quite sick. So what do we do now, doc? And it's like, okay, so starting with digestion isn't the panacea that I'm being told. And so by combining tools that are selected in a certain way, which I'll go into, we discovered that if we start with the outer immune system, with the exterior of the body first, we're least likely to make someone worse by helping them with these kind of more superficial things, especially chronic infections that are at this level. Then we can move into digestion, where because the immune system is a little bit more accurate and a little bit more honed, we can have increased tolerance in the digestive tract. A lot of my Western training almost lumped the immune system with the digestive system, because a lot of the lymph tissue is in there, but three-dimensionally we can kind of separate them out, and physiologically we can separate them out in terms of the depth in the body. Then moving into like neuroendocrine balance, not hormone supplementation yet, which is one of the things I was taught to start with first, which is also interesting. And then once we know that a lot of the pathogens are handled and a lot of the gut rot is handled, then increasing blood flow, if that makes sense clinically, and only looking at things that I would describe as boosting or supplementing, like hormones or nutrients or other things that often the body needs, but if they're are opportunistic bacteria they also really love. And we do that last if necessary. And often, even if people have had long-term fatigue, they find that they don't really need to do that as a separate step once the system's been ungunked.
So you're talking about more superficial immune system. Can you give me an example? I'm trying to think. So if they have a skin infection, is that what you're talking about? Or what
That
could
would,
they?
yeah, that would be kind of taking that at the most extreme. Because the way I was originally trained to look at the immune system was on a blood test, right? And so you have
Yep.
these white blood cell markers in these compartments, and they're floating around and they're disembodied. And there's kind of this, we sort of forget that we have this barrier system, which also gets put in the textbooks, right? We have pores that open and close. Those pores and the sweat can release like very specific antimicrobial substances, but then we have tissues behind that. But there isn't really a discussion of clinically how you can address these different layers in a certain way. Whereas the Chinese medicine first principles actually does have a lot to say about where pathogens are in the body and how you can affect superficial layers. So a skin infection would be something that you could see, but even working inside of that before we're already in the gut.
So that's fascinating. Just spitballing here. It's because my brain's going all over the place as you're talking. It makes me think, and you talk about sweating and how that is part of the immune system. It's part of the detoxification system as well. So, uh, correct me if I'm wrong. If somebody comes to you and I don't know if you ask them this, but they have a difficult time sweating or they're sweating too much, those are clues about
Yes, sir.
that function, right?
Absolutely.
And then that helps you guide those clinical decision making. And that's nothing that typically a conventionally somebody's going to be asked those questions as
Totally. And
yeah.
anyone listening, does that, requires zero medical background for anyone to understand this and operationalize it. And it really is that important. Sometimes, especially if we've been chronically ill for a long time, we we kind of get lost in this belief that it has to be really, really complicated and really, really, but this
Right.
is the basic things are super important. And if your sweating is kind of backwards from where it should be, you're not gonna, there's gonna be a limit to how far you're gonna get. This is a very important fundamental part of how we detoxify and how our immune system self-regulates. So we look at that.
God, what a fascinating approach. How can people learn more about this and what you're doing?
Sure. So I'm over at synthesishealth.co, and that's where, I run a group and it's completely free to apply to be a guest. If your application is approved, I'm just looking to see if clinically you're a good fit. Also, we want to make sure, it's a really positive and supportive group of people. And so we have like kind of the whole World Wide Web. So we have to filter a little bit to make sure everyone's kind. But then if you are accepted, you have an opportunity to spend some time you're in the group with annual members, and you can see in real time how I answer questions or troubleshoot things. There's dozens of videos where you can learn a little bit more about these frameworks that I'm talking about, how to think about things a little bit differently, and then you can have an opportunity to apply to go through a long-term process to reverse engineer health.
And then I've got to imagine people also have, learn from other people and the questions other people are asking.
100%. So this was before I shifted how I practice. There was the frustration of doing one-to-ones. Of course, I love to see my patients, but I'd spend an hour with them, and you go through and you give, let's say, this explanation of why their blood sugar is low or whatever it is. That's a one-to-one. That conversation is now done, and you might have the same conversation a few times later that day. And if you're the patient, there's really a limit to how much you can absorb from an interaction like that, especially if you have brain fog. So if you have a pre-recorded thing that you can watch as many times as you want, and then when someone asks me, a good question, I'll record a new thing, and then everyone gets the benefit. But I think even more than that is being in a group. I'm like a kind of the original introvert, so the idea of groups does not kind of on the paper thrill me. But when it comes to healing, it is really hard to heal alone, and having
Yeah.
complex chronic illness is very isolating. And then if you're trying to do things differently, you're the weirdo who doesn't want to take the meds, then it's even more isolating. But the main thing is that people learn from each other's questions, and they just learn so much more than they ever could from one-to-ones.
And there's just such power in community. I mean, that is undeniable.
Yeah.
Um, eh, on the last, kind of minute or two we've got here, anything you want to mention that we didn't talk about?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so much to talk about, but I think no, I think I really hit on kind of some of the themes that I really want people to understand, that just shifting the lens a little bit from feeling like all of the answers to our health are at this microscopic level with Latin names and big numbers of questionable validity, I think we'd both say,
Yeah.
to the amount of gold that you can mine by learning how to interpret pretty simple, mundane things that you can track. Because the other thing with lab testing is that I discovered in retrospect, it has a very long and expensive feedback cycle. So if you do a set of labs and then you are kind of undergoing this process based on them, a few months later, you don't know where they are until you rerun them. And if you feel better in that time, fantastic. But if you don't have too much to go on. But if you can learn how to navigate things that are changing, maybe on a weekly basis or even on a monthly basis, then that's information and a skill that you have for life, and that you can always use to understand what you need to take at the same time. Because if there were a treatment for any of the problems I named, you would have heard about it. It's really about what's going on in your system.
And it puts people in the driver's seat of their own lives, which is
Yeah.
phenomenal. Thank you for spending some time with me. I learned a ton. I'm excited to learn more by checking out your website. Anybody listening to this, definitely go look at her website and check out, apply, because I know so many people who are struggling with chronic illnesses. They haven't gotten the answers, and even locally, maybe they've been to different doctors and haven't gotten the answers. This approach that you're talking about, well founded, well thought out, very very meticulous and thoughtful, something I think a lot of people benefit from. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.